If you would, please turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24, and we are picking up in the Olivet Discourse. We are in verse 15, and just a heads up, I will be spending most of our time in verse 15. So if 30 minutes have gone by and we're still in verse 15, rest assured all is going according to plan. I don't plan on keeping you here for an hour and a half long sermon, but most of our focus this morning will be on verse 15, where we have mention of the Abomination of Desolation. To give you some context, those of you that haven't been here, in chapter 23, at the end of the chapter, we had that severe reproof to the religious leaders, the hypocrites in Israel. Chapter 23, you remember that? It ended there in verse 39, but in verse 38, Jesus said, "See, your house is left to you desolate." He made a proclamation in regards to the temple. This elicited the disciples then showing him the temple, and we looked at those first verses in Matthew 24. You can also study Luke 13. You can also study Luke 21. You can also study Mark 13 along with this. But the disciples come and they show him the magnificence of the temple, almost to say, like, this temple, Lord, this is the one that's going to be desolate. That was very difficult for them to wrap their minds around. Jesus affirmed that, Matthew 24, verse 2. He says, "Do you see all these things? Like, assuredly I say to you." I think this is the Old Testament way of saying, take a picture, because it's not going to be around for long. Do you see it? Because assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another, and that shall not be thrown down. Verse 3, then he sat on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him. We find out from the other accounts, this is Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And this is private. They come to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be?" Specifically in the context of the destruction of the temple, right? Matthew gives us the detail in the second half of the question, "And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Again, it would seem the assumption from the disciples was, if the temple's getting destroyed, that's got to be the end of the world. They seem to lump those two things together. And so as Jesus answers that question, I believe he's answering both facets of it, though the disciples don't understand that there would be almost 2,000 years, right, at least, between the destruction of the temple and the end of the age. Has Jesus literally returned yet? Has he come again? Is he coming again? He is coming again. Has he come? Literally. Has he returned? He hasn't. It's not the end of the age yet. So there's a big comma in between those things. I don't think the disciples understood that. I think that's clear. But we have looked at what he said would precede those days, the birth pains. You remember he talked about deception, verses 4 and 5. Wars and rumors of wars. Don't be troubled, verse 6. All these things must come to pass. Nation rising against nation, verse 7. Kingdom against kingdom. Famines, pestilence, earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Again, look back over 2,000 years of human history and look at the worst of those things and remember that those are birth pains. It's going to be worse than that. They're going to grow in frequency and intensity. There's going to be less of a break between these cataclysmic events, these apocalyptic events that we would see happen. Last week we spoke about persecution. No doubt persecution in one sense falls under that same category. It's always been there. I believe it's going to get worse as time goes on. I don't think it's going to get better. And we looked at the Mark and Luke and the synoptic gospels and how they talked about persecution. Luke certainly gives us some things that were fulfilled even in the book of Acts, and we looked at history itself and last week in regards to persecution. And our exhortation, verse 13, "He who endures to the end shall be saved." Importance that our faith endures. Will our faith stand the trials and temptations of life? It made me think of the parable of the sower. I didn't bring it up last week, but Matthew chapter 13, verse 20, he says, "But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself," but notice, "endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arise because of the word, immediately he stumbles. So there's those, they grab hold of the faith until somebody starts to poke their finger in their chest and say, you mean to tell me you believe the Bible? Tribulation and persecution arises because of what? The Word of the gospel, right? That Jesus is the only way to go to heaven. Again, that's a very offensive message. We watched the whole flow of that last week as we went through verses 9 through 14. Luke, as he gives that parable of the sower, says the ones on the rock are those who, when they hear, they receive the word with joy, and these have no root, who believe for a while, and in a time of temptation fall away. So we need to keep believing, right? As the world throws tribulation and persecution, and we go through the trials and difficulties of this life, we need to remain in the faith. We need to continue in the faith. Jesus there says in verse 15, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation. Now, all three gospel writers give us this warning to the inhabitants of Judea to flee, okay? Mark 13, Luke 21, and this chapter, Matthew 24, all give us account of this. There's three events that I want to draw to your attention, and I recognize actually this morning that the grass may get a little tall for some of us. It might be hard to follow some of this. I'd encourage you got a piece of paper and a pencil, get it out and jot some stuff down. You could ask me questions afterwards, because I'm going to try to give you a concise, thumb-nailed sketch of some very detailed and difficult things. So I'm not going to cover everything here, but there are three events that get associated with the abomination of desolation. There is a past event, roughly 168 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes. We'll get into that. There is a near future event, which is the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. It's my opinion that Luke focuses on that. I'll show you that in particular. And then there's this future event, date still to be determined, and that's the coming of the Antichrist and the things that are spoken in regards to him. Near future, 70 AD, the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, it would seem Luke, as he gives his account of this, focuses specifically on that event. And we have that in Luke chapter 21, verse 20. Jesus says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. Verse 24, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So Luke gives us a lot of the same things in regards to fleeing into Judea, but what's different about Luke's account is both the sign that he gives and also the conclusion that he gives on this passage. Excuse me. The sign that he gives is when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. And of course, this took place, Titus, who was the son of Vespasian. There's a bunch of Roman history that you could study on this, but Titus surrounded Jerusalem in 70 AD, and there was a 5-month-long siege. They built a wall around Jerusalem. They basically starved out the Israelites at that time, and basically, after pushing their way in through the Antonia fortress, they worked their way up onto the Temple Mount, which was like a 36-acre platform where the temple sat, and then somebody threw I believe a burning timber from a gate in through one of the windows of the temple, and the temple caught fire, and that's what really tipped the scales. It was a 5-month siege with the Roman army. That's no small task for these Jewish people to hold off the Roman army for 5 months. I believe they said it was the 5th and the 10th and the 12th and the 15th Roman legion. 3 legions were on one side. I believe The 10th legion was on the east side on the Mount of Olives. I mean, there's history ad nauseum on this. You can read Josephus about it. So that's the sign that Jesus gives in Luke 21:20 when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. The conclusion, verse 24, they will fall by the edge of the sword, be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So Luke gives this like historical, it's prophetic, but it's a historical thing. Like this is going to be the nature of the land of Israel until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And it's just prophetic significance on that little phrase there, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. You know, you would think, we look at this and we see Jews back in the land, right? 1948. How close to the end of the time of the Gentiles are we now? You got to think we're close. I'm not trying to pin the tail on the donkey with dates or nothing, but you look at that and you go, the times of the Gentiles to be fulfilled, I mean, they're back in the land. No, now, there's you look at the Temple Mount, what's there? Anybody know what's on the Temple Mount right now? Dome of the Rock, right? So still trampled by Gentiles, but the Jews are back in the land. Are things heading in that direction? God's got a plan for the nation of Israel. You know, Daniel gives us those 70 weeks, right? And there's that pause between the 69th week and the 70th week. I believe that 70th week represents the 7-year tribulation, where God will then turn his attention again to Israel. And the times of the Gentiles would be that comma between the 69th week and the 70th week. I know people have different opinions on some of this stuff, and I don't want to take myself too seriously. I want to take the Scripture seriously. But there's a lot to consider here. Luke, it seems, focuses in on, in his account, the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And he warns, Jesus warns those that are in Judea, very specific, all three accounts, those that are in Judea. This is specific for that land. But Matthew and Mark does the same thing. Matthew and Mark are really very similar on this. Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. So Matthew tells us that this is something that was spoken by Daniel the prophet. And I would just, a side note, it says Daniel the prophet, right? Not Daniel the historian. Does anybody's Bible say Daniel the historian? Some of you who study the Bible and know some of the criticisms against the book of Daniel, the book of Daniel is so prophetically accurate that it comes over extreme criticism in the detail that it gives, especially in chapter 11 regarding the Macedonian Empire and Alexander the Great and the Syrian wars. It speaks in great detail to those things, so much so that critics like to say, oh, the book of Daniel was written, after all this stuff happened. Well, Jesus refers to Daniel as a prophet, not a historian. Not a false historian who's telling a story about things an angel said prophetically that he didn't say prophetically. It's a pretty bold accusation against the book of Daniel. But the book of Daniel does, in chapter 11, give profound detail to the historical events that surrounded the rise and fall of Alexander the Great, and then those Syrian wars that took place between the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic Empire. And you can study this as much as you want to dig in. The Seleucid Empire would be Syria, Turkey area, and then as you would go east towards India, that was the Seleucid Empire. The Ptolemaic Empire was more centered around Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. The Jews were stuck right in the middle in that. In Daniel chapter 11, you go look at the prophecies that are there. It's extremely detailed. But in verse 21 of Daniel 11, a person comes to the focus in that chapter, and it says, and in his place shall arise a vile person to whom they will not give honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. And this is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. He was a Seleucid king. Epiphanes in the Greek means manifest. They refer to him as viewing himself as God manifest, or that he was Zeus manifest. This is what this guy thought of himself. He earned the nickname. If you switch out the PH with an M, you get Epimanes, and that's the madman. So they nicknamed him the madman. You can find on the internet pictures of coins that were minted during his reign where it says King Antiochus, God manifest. So this guy thought he was God manifest, that he was the manifestation of Zeus. And there's a whole bunch of history on him. Daniel chapter 11, verse 29, as you study through chapter 11 from verse 21 forward, it's Antiochus Epiphanes, and then we get some prophetic things at the end of Daniel. But it says in verse 29, at the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. Verse 30, 4 ships from Cyprus shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved, and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the covenant. Verse 31, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary, about the abomination of desolation. But what's being referred to here is that Antiochus came down from the Seleucid Empire down into the area of Egypt, the Ptolemaic Empire, to attempt to siege it. And I'll read this. This is from Polybius. He's a 2nd century BC Greek historian. He's contemporary with Antiochus. He lived at the same time. He says, when Antiochus had advanced to attack Ptolemy in order to possess himself of Pelusium, he went and met the Roman. He was met by the Roman commander Gaius Popilius Linus. You guys familiar with him? Linus, from Peanuts. You guys are tracking with me? Okay. Just making sure you guys are still awake. Upon the king greeting him from a distance and holding out his right hand to him, Popilius answered by holding out the tablets which contained the decree of the Senate, and bade Antiochus read that first, not thinking it right, I suppose, to give the usual sign of friendship until he knew the mind of the recipient, whether he were to be regarded as friend or foe. So Antiochus reaches out his hand to shake this Roman Senate guy's hand, and he goes, here, why don't you read this before I shake your hand? So Rome comes in as Antiochus is trying to, invade Egypt. They send word to Rome. Rome sends this guy down, and he confronts Antiochus and basically says, you need to get out of Dodge. You need to get out of here. It says, on the king, after reading the dispatch, so he basically reads what the Senate guy gives to him. It says that he desired to consult with his friends on the situation. So he reads, Rome says you got to go. And he goes, well, let me talk that over with my friends. And this is kind of a famous thing in history where it says Popilius did a thing which was looked upon as exceedingly overbearing and insolent. Happening to have a vine stick in his hand, he drew a circle around Antiochus with it and ordered him to give an answer to the letter before he stepped out of that circumference. So it's as if Popilius Linus says, hey, take all the time you want, but don't step outside the circle. Don't step outside that circle until you tell me what you want to do, or you're going to have problems with Rome. And so after a brief interval of embarrassed silence, he replied that he would do whatever the Romans demanded. Then Popilius and his colleagues shook him by the hand, and they all greeted him with warmth. It's like, come here, buddy, and you just think, wow, that's intense, man. These guys, they greet him with warmth. The contents of the dispatch was an order to put to end the war with Ptolemy at once. Accordingly, a stated number of days was allowed him within which he withdrew his army into Syria in high dudgeon. You know what high dudgeon is? Really unhappy. He was really not happy about this. Indeed, and groaning in spirit, but yielding to the necessities of the time. Rome said, I got to go. I don't want trouble with Rome, so I guess I got to go. He wasn't happy about it. And that's what Daniel said back in Daniel 11:29. For ships come from Cyprus against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant. So Antiochus is all dressed up in military array, but he's got nowhere to go now, right? All dressed up with nowhere to go. So as he goes back north towards the Seleucid Empire, who's in the way? Well, there's little old Israel. There's Jerusalem. And you can study the Maccabees on this. It's part of the Apocrypha. It's not considered inspired in regards to the Scripture. It's certainly considered useful in regards to history. They tell us, 2 Maccabees 5:5 tells us there was a false rumor that Antiochus had died, which led to a revolt. And so he comes back and he finds this mess in Jerusalem. And we read this in 2 Maccabees 5:11. Now, when this that was done came to the king's car, he had thought that Judea had revolted, whereupon, removing out of Egypt in a furious mind, he took the city by force of arms and commanded his men of war not to spare such as they met and to slay such as went up upon the houses. Thus there was a killing of young and old, making away of men, women, and children, slaying virgins and infants. And there were destroyed within this space of 3 days 80,000. Anybody know how many 80,000 is? 80 is what? 80,000. Score is 20. 80, is 80,000. Whereof 40,000 were slain in the conflict, and no fewer sold than slain. So we're told of that military, he just vents his frustrations on Jerusalem. Josephus in the Antiquity of the Jews, and I'm giving these details because people have heard about these things. Maybe they don't know what the resources are on these, so I'm mentioning these resources not to belabor things or to draw things out, but so that people have these things available and they can look at them themselves. Josephus in the Antiquity of the Jews, and this is Book 12, Chapter 5, Section 4, speaking of Antiochus, he says, when the king had built an idol altar upon God's altar, he slew a swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice neither according to the law nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. He also compelled them to forsake the worship which they had paid their own God, and to adore those whom he took to be gods, and made them build temples and raise idol altars in every city and village, and offer swine upon them every day. This is what Antiochus Epiphanes did in his rage when he went back to Jerusalem in the land of Israel. He goes on to say in Antiquity of the Jews, Book 13, Chapter 8, Section 2, Antiochus Epiphanes, who, when he had taken the city, offered up swine on the altar and sprinkled the temple with the broth of their flesh in order to violate the law of the Jews and the religion they derived from their forefathers, for which reason our nation made war with him and would never be reconciled to him. So this whole thing, to put this in some mental context for you, this led to the Maccabean revolt, which led to the cleansing of the temple, which is celebrated, the Feast of Dedication, which is Hanukkah. That's what they're celebrating. They're celebrating the cleansing of the temple when it was desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes. If that helps you kind of mentally map. And this all happens in the intertestamental period, right? So around 168 and then into 64 BC. So the Jews, so when Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, there's significance to this because the Jews in his day would have gone, wait a minute, that happened. They're very familiar with this. Josephus mentions this as a fulfillment. What Antiochus Epiphanes did, Josephus mentions it, Antiquity of the Jews 12:7-6. This was a fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel. That's what Josephus said about it. That's what he thought about it. First Maccabees 1:54. Now on the 15th day of the month of Caslu in the 145th year, that's the Seleucid calendar, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. So they viewed that as fulfilled, but Jesus says, when you see it, and he says it to his disciples, So that tells us there's a future fulfillment of this abomination of desolation. That though it was fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC, there is a future fulfillment yet to come. You guys tracking with me so far? You guys hanging in there? But you need to stand up and shake it off a little bit. Do one of these numbers. You guys good? So there's a future fulfillment of it. Because Jesus says, when you see it. And the Jew might have gone like, wait a minute, we know about what that was that's in our history books. No. There's something worse coming. Daniel, as he speaks about those 77s or those 77-year periods, and we discussed this briefly when we went over Jesus' triumphal entry, he gives great detail in regards to that timeline. And in Daniel chapter 9, speaking of that last 7-year period, he says, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. This speaks to the final 7-year period. As you look at Daniel and the prophecy that pointed to the Messiah, the end of those 69 weeks that the Messiah would come, Daniel spoke that prophetically to the day. And then he speaks about this final 7-year period and says in the middle of that, there's going to be on the wings of abominations, there's going to be one who makes desolate, a reference to the Antichrist. So there's a future fulfillment of this. Daniel chapter 12, verse 11 says, from the time that the daily sacrifices is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. That's 3.5 years. If you're using the Julian calendar plus 30 days, there's a bunch of discussion about that, but roughly 3.5-year time period. And you can take those 3.5-year time periods right into the book of Revelation and look at how those things connect to the Antichrist, to the 2 witnesses that are in Jerusalem, to the woman who's pursued by the dragon. There's a bunch of prophecy that has that same 3.5-year time frame. Points to it. And in Daniel 11, as he's speaking about Antiochus Epiphanes, in verse 36, there seems to be a shift in that section where it begins to be more prophetic, looking to the future. And it says in verse 36, then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, and speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. What's interesting about that is that Antiochus Epiphanes thought he was the manifestation of Zeus. So he thought himself to be God, but he also honored Zeus, built temples to Zeus. The Antichrist, it would seem, doesn't want anything to do with any god, but proclaims himself to be God. And we have that given to us by Paul as well in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He says, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that's called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So Paul, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4, says very much the same thing of what we had there in Daniel 11, 36 and 37. It's interesting because he talks about that day. Now you've got to make a decision how you interpret this. Either Paul is referring to that day as 70 AD, which does not seem to fit, or there's a future fulfillment yet to come. He's speaking about the Antichrist. And he says there that he sits, notice, as God in the what? In the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Have the Jews got a temple right now? They don't. Are there people out there that really want to build a third temple? There are. And I've heard about this in teachings, and it's kind of like gone over my head a little bit, like, oh, I hear about, there's the Temple Institute in Jerusalem, and there's these people that are serious about a third temple, and you kind of go, oh yeah, and you hear about that, and you go, yeah, that sounds familiar. Well, you can get on their website, okay? They got a website. They've got a video where they go out in the streets of Tel Aviv, and they ask people, what would it mean to you if there was a temple? And it's pretty scary to listen to people's responses. Some of the people are saying, well, we all worship the same God anyway, so it'd be a place where everybody could come together and worship the same God because we all worship the same God. And I go, boy, that sounds like you're pretty deceived. Do we all worship the same God? No. No, we don't. There's one true and living God. You know, when they look at these verses that talk about my house would be a house of prayer for all nations, that's not saying that it would be inclusive for all religions. That's speaking about how the gospel, the one and only true gospel, would go out into all the world and touch all nations. So it's all centered around who He is. But they're out there, like the Temple Institute, templeinstitute.org. You can check it out. You can watch the video. If you're really curious about who the Antichrist is going to be, I suppose you could donate to their cause. That's a joke. Is this thing on? So, you know, you don't know, are they going to be the ones to make it happen? We don't know that. But do we know that there's people that take a third temple serious? Yeah, they've been around since 87. EST 87, man, they've been around for a little while working on this. They got some stuff. The menorah, they're working on the clothes for the priests. Last I heard, they found the red heifer so they could get the ashes of the red heifer. You know, all this, you hear about all this stuff, and it's kind of like over the top of your head, but check it out. You can go to their website, and like these people are serious about that. One of the people they ask, what would a third temple mean to you? And one guy says, I don't know, World War III? I thought, that's pretty good. Temple Mount, Dome of the Rock, how's that going to happen? Don't know. If there's a literal fulfillment, if there's a literal Antichrist, and he's going to sit in the temple of God and show himself that he is God, if this abomination of desolation that Jesus talks about, if there's a future literal fulfillment of it, he says when you see him standing in the holy place, very specific, the one that Daniel talked about. So the Antichrist also specifically in 2 Thessalonians 2:8, Paul says, then the lawless one will be revealed, notice, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. The Antichrist will be killed personally by Jesus at his second coming. So I don't believe this is talking about anything that took place in 70 AD. In regards to the temple, John is given a vision in Revelation chapter 11, and I don't have the slide for this, but John is given a vision of the temple, and that's the chapter that tells us about the two witnesses. And it's worth noting that most believe that the book of Revelation was written around 94 or 95 AD as John was banished to the Isle of Patmos under Domitian. So 94 or 95 AD is 24 or 25 years after the destruction of Herod's temple. So for him to get a vision and be told to measure a temple in the tribulation, it says there in verse 1, now I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and an angel stood saying, rise and measure the temple of God, the altar and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot 42 months. Don't know what to do with all the details of that, but many view that as a picture of the tribulation temple. This is given to John 25 years after Herod's temple was destroyed. So, you put this all together, Mark and Matthew, it does certainly seem that they are giving us a little bit more than just what would take place in 70 AD. when they say, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Now, your Bible might have, if you have Jesus' words in red, those letters might be in red, they might be in black. People are discussed whether this was, Jesus said this, or whether Mark and Matthew in their account, recorded this themselves. But it's that kind of statement that's like, when you're around, if you're the one that's reading this, when this stuff is happening, you need to understand what's going on. You need to be informed about it. And it is one of those kind of like prophetic statements that speaks to the contemporary reader of the event. And no doubt people took warning in 70 AD. And I believe that there will be people that take warning from this in the Great Tribulation. So he says, verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains again. So this is Judea-centric, okay? This is about the things that would be happening in Judea. Let them flee to the mountains. There is this picture that we have prophetically in Revelation of the woman and the dragon in chapter 12. We're given the picture there and how there's this great war that breaks out in heaven, Revelation 12:7. The great dragon was cast out, Revelation 12:9. And then we read this in Revelation 12:12. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a time. So a time, most view a year, times, 2 years, and a half a year, 3.5 years. From the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed out water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. Verse 16, but the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened up its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God, who have the testimony of Jesus Christ. That all makes enough sense to you, right? About the earth and the flood and the woman, right? You read that and you go, what is going on there? But you've got the woman who flees, right? And she's protected for a time, times, and a half a time. She flees into the wilderness. She's given, 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness. Could very well be a synonymous picture there of the children of Israel, the Israelites, the Jews in that day, fleeing from the Antichrist. What's very interesting about Revelation 12, you get the picture of the devil being cast down to earth. What comes after 12? What number? Stay awake. 13. Chapter 13. Okay, you've got the Antichrist, the beast who rises up out of the sea. You've got this very interesting picture of the devil being cast down to earth, and then the Antichrist rising up out of the midst of the sea. So could be that that's what's being spoken of there in Matthew 24. Verse 17, he says, let him who's on the housetop not go down, take anything out of his house. Let him who's in the field not go back to get his clothes. Leave your iPad, right? Leave your stuff, right? It's not worth it. Don't go back. Don't look back. Like Lot's wife, don't go back. Man, we get so attached to our stuff. It's like, oh, I got stuff in my basement. Anybody got stuff in their basement? Boy. Preach it, brother. We love our stuff, man. No, leave your stuff. And woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. Man, being pregnant and nursing babies is hard enough as it is. Amen, ladies? I've not been pregnant nor nursed a baby, but I know somebody who has. So great difficulty. He says there, verse 20, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Again, very centered in regards to the land of Israel. Winter seems to be just the difficulty of the climate. It wouldn't be adverse then. Sabbath, people talk about like the Sabbath day in particular, and your translation may even say Sabbath day. Day's not in there, it's just the Sabbath. That's only one day. So my thought, and there's guys that talk about the Sabbath year, the sabbatical year, where they would leave their fields fallow, which would make sense if somebody was making a run for the hills, like at least if it wasn't winter or not on the Sabbath, they could have some provision, some food from the fields. There'd be something to glean. That's a thought on that. But again, this is all very Jewish. You look at this, from verse 15 down through verse 22. This is the land of Judea. This is Abomination of Desolation standing in the holy place. Very centered around what will be taking place in Israel, and I believe in the Great Tribulation. He says, verse 21, "For there will be great tribulation," and this is where Matthew and Mark differ greatly from Luke in how they describe the conclusion, okay? Matthew says, "There will be great tribulation, such has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be." Jesus says the time that he's describing in particular is going to be the worst time in human history. The worst time in human history. Since the beginning of the creation of God, I believe it says in Mark 13. So that would include the flood of Noah. This is going to be worse. You want to know how bad it is? Read Revelation chapter 6 through 19. That's how bad it is. You've got the seals and the trumpets and the woes and the bowls and the second coming. It says it's going to be the worst time in human history. You ain't seen nothing yet, and it's not getting better. Right? Make sure you know where your hope is. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 6 says, "Ask now and see whether a man is ever in labor with child. So why do I see every man with his hands on his loins like a woman in labor, and all faces turned pale? Alas, for that day is great, so that there is none like it. And it is a time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it." He shall be saved out of it. Man, underline that. Jeremiah 30, verses 6 and 7. Daniel chapter 1, verse 12. "At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book." I think these look forward to the tribulation that's going to be cut short by the return of Christ. The Jews will be delivered by Jesus personally. And Jesus says, verse 22, "And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." And you think about human history, I don't think there's ever been a time where that statement there, unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. I mean, we look at that now, and that is like a real thing. You look at nuclear warfare. I mean, what was the world going to do, 1,000 years ago? Were they going to destroy themselves? I mean, we got nuclear bombs that could wipe out the planet, Chemical warfare, biological warfare, nuclear warfare. I mean, where are we at in regards to human history, in regards to our capacity to annihilate all flesh on the planet? Jesus says, unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. When you put together what the judgment that God is going to pour out in the Great Tribulation, and then what man is going to be doing to man, it's going to require divine intervention. And I believe that's what it refers to there when it says, "But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." I believe probably in the context here, verse 22, the elect is a reference to the nation of Israel, his people. In the fulfillment of prophecy that there will be this time of great trouble where he will deliver them, that he will come again. Romans chapter 11, verse 25, Paul says, "I don't desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion. that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. So you see that time frame there again? There's like this period. There's this Gentile period. And blindness in part is upon the nation of Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles have come in. And then verse 6, and so all Israel will be saved, as it's written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn ungodliness from Jacob, for this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So there's a future work for the nation of Israel, and they will be, delivered at the end there of the great tribulation. So for us as believers, I think, I looked at how Luke concludes this whole Olivet discourse, and I would share this with you. Luke 21:34 says, "Take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness," and then look at that one, the cares of this life. Right? Like, you don't have to be out in the bars to be asleep. You know what I mean? He says, lest your heart be weighed down, carousing, drunkenness. The cares of this life can weigh our hearts down. We're just so caught up in the day-to-day. We're not thinking about maybe how close to eternity are we? That's true of all of us individually. None of us are promised tomorrow. Do you know that? Every man at his best state is a vapor. Every man at his best state. How many of you in here are in your best state? Anybody in their prime? Maybe there's a couple of you. Well, if you are, good news, you're a vapor. In your best state, because, car accident happens, right? Somebody, how many people know somebody who's just gone? Here 1 minute, gone the next. Every man at his best state is a vapor. That day, he says, it can come upon you unexpectedly. No doubt there's prophetic significance for that day. We'll talk about that, Lord willing, in the weeks to come. But you can be standing before God in a moment. How many people are we seeing drop, right? That's just going on, right? Football field, the guy barely hits a guy, and he just collapses, and they got to give him CPR until the ambulance shows up. But that day, the specific day, the day of the Lord, it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. So that's not just relative to the nation of Israel. It will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Jesus says to his disciples, then watch therefore and pray always. What's our marching orders this week? Man, it's right there. Watch and pray always. Be awake, not woke. Be awake to the days that we live in. Pray always. What's the rest of that verse say? That you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass. It says it right there. Pray that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass. Well, you're just an escapist, man. Have you read Revelation 6 through 19? Yeah, I'm an escapist. Jesus tells me to be an escapist. He says there, pray that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass. I'm okay with that. You know what? If I'm wrong about being pre-trib, I'll have time to wrap my mind around it. Right? Oops, I was wrong. I got some time to reconcile those thoughts. If you're post-trib and you're wrong about that, you won't have any time to wrap your mind around it. Because in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye, your corruption will put on incorruption. And you'll be in the presence of the Lord, right? But I don't want to grind any theological axes this morning, but I had to throw that in there. Man, you look at this last verse, right? Unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, it will be shortened. Think about this and this is taking it out of its context and just using it for application, okay? So I'm acknowledging that. But how many of us, if it wasn't for God's intervention in our lives, would have completely destroyed ourselves? right? I think of the path I was on before I accepted Christ. If I would have just continued to go in that direction, where would I be? Where's this world going to be? You think this world that we live in, you think it's going to fix itself. What's your money on? Is your money on that it's going to fix itself or that it's going to destroy itself? What's it look like? Well, we know the Bible tells us we don't need to make bets or come up with stuff. The Bible tells us what's going to happen. But you can certainly look at the world we live in. You can see where that's going, and maybe you can look at your own life and see where that's going if you don't know Jesus. Where's your life going? He's willing to intervene. He's willing to cut those days short and save. I so love that. He intervened in my life. I think, man, if I would have continued on the path that I was on and I didn't turn to Christ, I probably wouldn't, I know I wouldn't be here, obviously. But I don't even know if I'd be here, breathing here. So I'm so thankful for His intervention in my life that He, just like He's going to come literally into the world again, He came into my world. And He cut my suffering short. And He saved. I'm so thankful for that. I'm so thankful for what He's done for us. As we take communion, let's ask ourselves that question. Where would I be if He hadn't intervened in my life? Father, we thank You for this morning. We thank You for Your word.